You are listening to The Briefing, first broadcast on the 14th of May 2024 on Monocle Radio. Hello and welcome to The Briefing, live from Studio One here at Midori House in London. I'm Chris Chermak. Coming up on today's programme, we head back to Georgia, where students were among those striking on Tuesday as the parliament is expected to vote this afternoon on the controversial foreign agents law. After that,
we have a corrupt judge, and we have a judge who's highly conflicted, and he's keeping me from campaigning. He's an appointed New York judge. He's appointed. You know who appointed him? Democrat politicians. He's appointed.
Donald Trump's trial in New York. Here's from the prosecution's star witness. We'll look at what kind of effect this trial and others are having on the presidential campaign in the United States. After that, we'll hear from a Nato youth summit in Brussels that was moderated by Monocle's own Carlotta Rebello.
Hi, Chris. Yes, I was at the Nato HQ yesterday speaking with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, and I'll bring you some of the highlights of our conversation.
Thank you very much, Carlotta. We'll also get the latest business headlines and explore the return of Gucci, bringing Englishness with an Italian accent to a show right here in the British capital. All that right here on The Briefing with me, Chris Chermak. We start in Georgia, where protests have continued ahead of a vote in Parliament today that would clear the way for the government's foreign agents bill. The question now becomes what happens after the controversial bill is passed. Some are calling for a nationwide strike along with the ongoing protests, much like what happened in Ukraine in 2014. Georgia's prime minister himself rather ominously warned that his country did not want to suffer the fate of Ukraine if this bill was not passed. Well, Rayhan Dimitri is a BBC journalist who has been covering the protests in Tbilisi over the past few days. She joins us now from right outside Parliament. Rayhan, thanks very much for coming on the show. Bring us up to speed, first of all, on the last 24 hours. What has the mood been like heading into today's vote?
Well, the last 24 hours, Chris, and the last 48 hours, in the last 3 weeks, there have been continuous protests against this proposed bill, the foreign agents bill, and it's the second attempt by the Georgian government to push this law dubbed the Russian law. The first attempt being last year in 2023. It was called the foreign agents law and looked like an exact copy of the existing legislature in Russia. In Russia, it was adopted back in 2012 and has since expanded, and we all know what is the situation with human rights, with the freedom of speech and freedom of assembly in Russia. It's simply non-existent. So Georgians fear that the same thing might happen here, because this proposed bill this year is called on the transparency of foreign funding, targets specifically non-governmental organizations and independent media. And the government has downplayed the significance, saying, what is the big deal if we're asking these organizations to report us, submit annual report about where their money is coming from and what they're spending it on. But it's more than that. These organizations, they would have to label themselves as organizations representing the interests of foreign power. There are also heavy fines that will be imposed on these organizations if they don't comply. There will be regular checks by the Justice Ministry. So protesters here believe that it is just incompatible with the democracy which Georgia enjoys or has enjoyed up until now.
Rayhan, it doesn't feel like at this moment, at least, that protesters will be able to stop what's happening today. The government has the votes to pass this bill. So I do wonder what protesters feel the next step is at this point, to get a reversal of the bill, call for a government resignation, striking. I mean, how far could this go?
You know, partially, Chris, for all of these calls that you've just listed, I've heard it already from some of the protesters. They've been Actually, they have not been calling for the government to resign because Georgia is heading towards general elections later this year in October. And many here believe that this law is being pushed for ahead of the elections to specifically clear the space from critical voices in the country ahead of these crucial parliamentary elections. Why crucial? Because Georgian Dream government has been in power for 12 years, and it's unprecedented for any political party to hold on to power for that long. While Georgian Dream, the governing party, insists that they have a huge support in the country. They say that according to their own surveys that they have 60% support of the population of Georgia. They also claim that 60% of the Georgian public supports this bill. But nobody here in the streets, and right now it's daytime, there are not that many protesters, maybe a couple of thousand. We're expecting more, but over the weekend we saw a really, really huge crowds of people in the tens of thousands, if not more, saying no to the Russian law, as they call it. No, also yesterday I heard slogans, no to a Russian regime, as they refer to this government, because a lot of people believe that they're acting in Russia's interests. A short while ago I was recording some vox pops with the protesters now, and it's just you hear the same thing being repeated over and over again. They're saying, look, this is a takeover of our country by Russia, and we want Europe. They're saying they only see their country as part of the European Union, and that's why so many young people are taking part in these protests, because they believe that they are fighting, that this fight is crucial, that it is an existential crisis for Georgia, and they are determined to stay their ground.
Speaking of this fight for Georgia's future, what do we make of the Prime Minister's remarks likening this to Ukraine and the fate that Ukraine has suffered, that Georgia would lose its sovereignty if this bill is not passed? I mean, is this seen as a Ukraine moment also for the protesters in reverse? I mean, will this kind of comment galvanize them?
Well, perhaps you're referring to the speech by Bidzina Ivanishvili, the founder of the governing party, Georgian Dream. He's the most influential man in this country, and he holds all keys to power. So he delivered this speech on April the 29th when the government organized its own rally in support of the bill. They bussed in tens of thousands of people from mainly kind of civil servants from different regions of Georgia, and Bidzina Ivanishvili delivered this speech, and it was yes, he talked about the Ukraine scenario, but his speech was very anti-Western. He talked about, it was full of kind of conspiracy theories. He talked about the global party of war, and this country's prime minister has repeated the same kind of accusations against the global party of war, and journalists have been asking them, what do you mean by the global war? What is this global party of war? But they have implied that it is the West that has been funneling money into these non-governmental organizations that are planning or have been attempting several times to organize revolutions in Georgia. And in that speech it was clear, because there were a lot of references to agents and foreign agents, it was clear what the thinking is at the top kind of heads, leadership in this country. They hold and they see non-governmental organizations as a threat. They see them as being funded by the West, and that this money is being used to foment unrest or to unseat these governments. So the rhetoric, if you like, is in a way quite similar to what we are all used to hearing from Russia, let's say.
Thanks very much, Rayhan. That was Rayhan Dimitri. Now here's Vincent McAviney with the day's other news headlines.
Thanks, Chris. US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has arrived in Kyiv in a surprise diplomatic visit to underscore the United States' support for Ukraine. The trip is the first by a senior US official since Congress passed a delayed $61 billion military aid package for the country last month. Russian authorities have arrested another senior defense ministry official on the charges of bribery, a move that comes after President Vladimir Putin replaced the defense minister in a cabinet shakeup and amid expectations of further purges at the ministry. The official's home and other properties were searched, with the authorities seizing gold coins, luxury items and 100 million rubles in cash. The ongoing feud in the K-pop industry between Adore CEO Min Hee-jin and Hybe is taking a toll on shareholders, with Hybe's stock price dropping below the 200,000 won mark. The BTS label is also planning to ask for a financial supervisory service inquiry into alleged stock trading violations by Adore executives. Those are your headlines. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks very much, Vincent. To the U.S. now, where prosecutors in the trial of Donald Trump in New York saw their star witness take the stand yesterday. Michael Cohen, Trump's former lawyer, sought to tie Trump directly to the payments he made to porn star Stormy Daniels to keep quiet on her affair with Donald Trump. The former president's direct involvement in the payment is key to making stick what is now likely to be the only trial that Trump will face before this year's presidential elections. Well, joining us now is Washington reporter Simon Marks. Simon, good to have you on the show. Michael Cohen made this point of saying under oath that everything he did goes through Donald Trump, that Trump was in the room for many of these discussions. This really is the key to everything, isn't it?
Yes, that's absolutely right, Chris. A critical piece of testimony there by Michael Cohen, who also allowed the jury to hear him saying that I was doing everything I could and more to protect my boss, which is something that I had done for a long time. And the jury really got to look underneath the waterline at the chaos that was taking place within the Trump organization after Donald Trump, in the dying weeks of the 2016 presidential election campaign, learnt that Stormy Daniels was threatening to sell her story to the National Enquirer tabloid newspaper, a story claiming that she'd had this affair with Donald Trump that, of course, Donald Trump still to this day vigorously denies. Various senior figures within the Trump organization were scrambling to determine, according to Michael Cohen, how they could make the $130,000 payment to Stormy Daniels to silence her. And the organization's chief financial officer was initially asked to make the payments, Mr. Cohen testified, but Alan Weisselberg said he couldn't do it because he was too financially strapped, covering the costs of 4 grandchildren attending private schools and private summer camps. So Michael Cohen took out a home equity loan that he said he chose to pursue because it was a paperless route to acquiring cash quickly. That money was then paid to Stormy Daniels, and Donald Trump, according to Michael Cohen, and the jury has seen evidence of this in the form of checks, received 11 separate payments of $35,000 described as a legal retainer in the Trump organization's business records as repayment for the loan plus the taxes that Michael Cohen was going to have to incur as a result of having taken out that home equity line.
Now, Simon, I mean, the craziness of this trial is one aspect. The other, I guess, crucial aspect really is how this is going to impact a presidential campaign, both in the sense, or what is your sense, both of whether the public is really paying attention to this and, you know, could potentially change their mind about Trump based on what happens here, and also whether Trump could actually face jail time, either for ignoring gag orders or in sentencing?
Well, I think part of that does depend on what actually happens in the courtroom. And today, defense attorneys for Donald Trump will get their opportunity to try and start taking Michael Cohen's story apart. So there will be fresh fireworks for the jury to observe over the next few hours. But more broadly, Donald Trump, in political terms, had a good day on Monday because the New York Times published a new opinion poll indicating that his advantage over Joe Biden in 5 of the crucial battleground states where the 2020 2024 presidential election will be won or lost, is essentially either holding or in some cases widening. So that will have panicked the Biden White House, and the Trump team will view this as a further indication that Donald Trump's continued claims that he's the victim of what he calls lawfare, judicial persecution that he claims without evidence is entirely being orchestrated by Joe Biden from the White House, that those claims are resonating with members of the public. Week after week, month after month, polls show that more Americans have a favourable memory of Donald Trump's first term in office than they had when he left the White House. And depending, of course, on the outcome of this particular proceeding, and assuming that none of the other criminal cases against Donald Trump go to trial before November, which looks increasingly likely, then based on the polling that they're currently seeing, the Trump campaign can be pretty confident that these criminal cases, and this one in New York particularly, are not really touching the president politically.
Simon, speaking of lawfare, as you call it, it's not just striking Donald Trump himself. There is also just across the street another trial of another politician who is also refusing to step down based on any allegations thrown at him. That's the New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez. His own trial started yesterday as well over accepting cash and gold bribes. What can you tell us about that?
Well, one would have to say, Chris, that it's not a great advertisement for the health of American democracy to have two prominent politicians, one a Republican, Donald Trump, the other Bob Menendez, a Democrat, going on trial in Manhattan, both of them facing charges of differing degrees of seriousness. In the case of Senator Menendez, jury selection is still underway. No jurors were seated yesterday, the first day of his trial. He is accused of being at the centre of a 5-year bribery scheme that saw, according to prosecutors, Senator Menendez and his wife receiving a variety of blandishments from the government of Egypt in exchange for his assistance securing government aid and weapons for Egypt on Capitol Hill. And these blandishments that the Egyptians, according to prosecutors, offered included the cash and the gold bars recovered from the Menendez home, a Mercedes-Benz, paying off some of Bob Menendez's mortgage payments for his home. So this is according to prosecutors, a wide conspiracy scheme that could see Mr. Menendez facing a heavy jail sentence if he's convicted. He denies all the allegations, has consistently insisted that he has no plans to stand down from his Senate seat. Of course, he represents the state of New Jersey in the Senate, and he's a former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He's also no stranger to court cases, because back in 2017, a previous bribery case against him ended in a mistrial. There was a hung jury in that case. As jurors are questioned in this case, they are being warned to expect a trial that could last until July the 4th.
Trials upon trials. Biden's son Hunter also due to face trial in June. We'll have more on that going forward as well. Simon Marks, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. This is The Briefing on Monocle Radio. I'm Chris Chermak. It's time now for a roundup of the latest business news with Bloomberg's Ewan Potts. Ewan, President Biden has just announced a host of new tariffs on Chinese imports. It's a pretty big amount. Let's start with that.
Hello, Chris. Yes, a significant ramping up of US tariffs on goods from China. President Biden is announcing tariff hikes on a wide range of Chinese imports to include semiconductors, batteries, solar cells, critical minerals, and a whole host of other things. The biggest jump is for electric vehicles. The tariff rate there will quadruple to more than 100%. The tariff rate on semiconductors will double from 25 to 50% next year. That's targeting an industry that President Biden has made a centerpiece of his manufacturing agenda. He's throwing billions of dollars in subsidies to boost US production, and now he's attempting to hold back the flow of Chinese chips coming to the country. The White House says that the changes will affect around $18 billion in current annual imports, and the changes are staggered to take effect from now until 2026. It's worth remembering that this adds to the tariffs already put in place by President Biden and his predecessor, President Trump. So there are already tariffs on a lot of Chinese imports. It is rather more targeted than what's being proposed by candidate Trump. He's putting forward a flat 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. At least that is the rhetoric at the moment. I think the dual danger from this is that the additional tariffs, of course, risk increasing prices for consumers. These are taxes, and they have to be paid by somebody. They're either paid by the consumer or they're paid by importers or retailers. The cost has to come somewhere. And, of course, the US, like the rest of the world, has had a big problem with rising prices. So consumers won't welcome their Chinese imports getting more expensive. And, of course, there is the ire of China. The Chinese government could well choose to retaliate in kind. We haven't seen them taking these things lying down in the past, and there's a very real danger that they will impose tariffs on American imports.
Ewan, just to follow up on that quickly, what is the market reaction when it comes to that? Is there fear that we are now entering a new round of tariff wars between China and the US, and for that matter, the EU as well?
For all those years of globalization, of tariffs coming down, the World Trade Organization being all-powerful, just seems like a long time ago now, doesn't it? This tariff war between China and the US has really been ramping up. We saw a lot of tariffs imposed under President Trump, and China retaliated in kind pretty forcefully. So I think the danger from this is that we will see Beijing slapping sanctions on lots of US goods. We know they've been cracking down on Apple, which is a very important manufacturer, very important US company, and Chinese sales of iPhones have been slumping as the government there bans them from use in certain state-owned enterprises, not allowing people to take them into the office. So I think the chances of China just ignoring this and letting it pass have got to be pretty slim. So we'll have to watch from the next moves from Beijing.
And just one other story before we let you go. A battle over copper. What is the latest in the takeover bid for the miner Anglo-American?
Yeah, copper is a metal which is absolutely crucial to the energy transition. Producing the average EV uses a whole load of the stuff, and new wind and solar farms need copper for all that cabling, the transformers, and all the rest of it. So the battle to take over London-based miner Anglo-American is all about its copper assets. The company's today rejected a second higher offer from South African rival BHP Group, which is the world's biggest mining company. And Anglo has come out with a radical plan, one of the biggest reorganisations in its more than 100-year history. It says it's going to exit the storied De Beers diamond business, separate its platinum unit, and it will sell off its coking coal mines in Australia. Its nickel business in Brazil, also for the chop. The company's always been something of a hodgepodge of commodities, really, and the move to dramatically shrink and simplify its business has been years in the making. It's really had its hand forced in the last couple of weeks. De Beers, which is very much a trophy asset, has increasingly looked out of place within the Anglo stable, and the diamond market has become very volatile in recent years, whipsawing between boom and bust. But the disposal of De Beers will break a 100-year link between the companies, so it's going to be a tough breakup, as that will leave Anglo focusing almost entirely on copper and on iron ore, its two biggest, most consistent earners. And ironically, Anglo's plan is not dissimilar to the kind of breakup which was envisaged by BHP in its original offer. So we'll have to see whether shareholders prefer the takeover plan from BHP or the breakup defence plan from Anglo-American.
Ewan Potts, thank you very much for joining us. You are listening to The Briefing on Monocle Radio. Now here on The Briefing, the NATO military alliance has seen a revival of sorts in the past 2 years amid transatlantic debates over how to fend off Russia in Ukraine and how to defend NATO's own eastern borders should Russia decide to take this even further. That debate will need to include young people in Europe who have to live in this newly insecure environment. And to that point, yesterday the NATO Military Alliance hosted its 4th annual Youth Summit with discussions across both sides of the Atlantic in Stockholm, Miami, as well as a special panel from NATO headquarters in Brussels itself. Monocle's senior foreign correspondent Carlotta Rebello was there in Brussels, and she joins me now with more here in studio. Hello, Carlotta.
Hi, Chris.
So first of all, tell us about this youth summit. What is the goal here? What is it aimed at? Is it kind of aimed partly at assuaging the youth's concerns?
Well, yes, and the target audience here is really that age range between 20 and 35-year-olds. And that's not only those attending and watching, but also they try to make that the vast majority of the speakers, the youth leaders who are working alongside NATO and with the alliance's priorities. And it's very much to have a conversation about, the issues of peace and security that NATO stands for, and looking at why the future generation should care about it, and how are governments of those states within the alliance working alongside NATO to deliver on the key issues that the youth is concerned about.
There is always, I guess, a risk of perhaps apathy from the young, so I wonder to what extent that was discussed. I mean, you were at the NATO headquarters in Brussels. You were moderating a session with NATO's Secretary General, Jens Stoltenberg. Tell us about what he said, how he tried to cater to this demographic.
So it was really interesting because one of the things he made a point of really stressing was the importance of continued defense investment. And this comes at a time where the conversation about increased defense spending across the allies of NATO is, paramount. When you have pressing issues such as housing, education, the climate crisis, how do you convince governments to actually invest in defense? And he really made a point about the necessity of doing that to ensure peace. There is a tendency that when countries observe long-lasting peace, that the defense spending decreases. But then when you get to a point like we are witnessing now with the war in Ukraine, the conflict in Israel and Gaza, that tensions build up. Suddenly, nations can be found on the back foot of this. So actually, the pathway to maintaining peace is through an increase in defense spending. He also talked a lot about the enduring significance of NATO's Article 5. Now, this is the collective security guarantee, which is perhaps one of the key things that you get when you become a member. And he was referring that when alluding to the new members, Sweden and Finland. The fact that everyone is protected because an attack on one member is an attack on all. And NATO at the moment represents 50% of the world's military capacity. That is, it is a big assurance to have that if something would happen to you, you would have the backing of everyone else. So those are just some of the key themes in terms of the importance of thinking about this when thinking about a peaceful future.
So those were the themes that Stoltenberg wanted to bring up for the youth. What was the reaction from the youth to that? They also had a chance to ask Stoltenberg questions. What kind of things did they focus on that they wanted to hear from him?
Well, they asked a few questions about NATO's priorities in Ukraine, and this led to a really interesting conversation on reconstruction and how, reconstruction efforts, as much as NATO will and is involved in them, reconstruction starts with Ukraine winning. And that was something quite significant to hear from the Secretary General himself. There were also questions around NATO's relationships with countries outside of the alliance, particularly those in the Indo-Pacific region. We're talking here about Australia, Japan, and, the threat of China in that region and how is NATO navigating that. And then we also had some more personal questions. It was interesting. One of the last questions coming from the audience in Brussels was whether or not he always wanted to do this. Was this a field that he always wanted to work in? And the Secretary General was very honest and candid in telling that actually the one thing he knew he didn't want to do was politics, which obviously completely backfired, having been, Deputy Environment Minister, Finance Minister, Prime Minister. So he talked about that journey and then ended with some lovely career advice for, young professionals on sometimes it's good to, that things don't always go according to plan. But I guess the best piece of advice he let young people know in the audience was just be nice to everyone you work with, because you never know if you always will end up working with them again. So I think that is quite important.
Career advice from the outgoing NATO Secretary General. Carlotta Rebello, thank you very much for joining us. You're listening to The Briefing. And finally, on today's show, here in London, we've seen a takeover of parts of the city, including Monocle's own cafe by the famed Italian fashion brand Gucci, which is in town for a sparkly cruise show hosted at the Tate Modern. Natalie Theodosi, Monocle's fashion editor, joins us now right here in studio. Good afternoon, Natalie.
Good afternoon.
Natalie, the timing of this is significant for London in the sense that this is a city that has perhaps felt left out of the fashion scene a little bit of late. Why did Gucci come back?
Exactly, and I think that was the talk of the night last night at the show, that London got the vote of confidence from Gucci that it needed, and there were many reasons. I think cruise collections that happened this month are great opportunities for brands to take their collections on the road, explore new cities, start relationships. And this was very significant for Gucci because it was the creative director Sabato De Sarno's first cruise show. And they chose London because there was a lot of history to explore, a lot of stories to tell. Because the founder, Guccio Gucci, spent time as a young adult in London working as a porter at the Savoy Hotel and observing the travelers that were coming in and out, drawing inspiration. And then he went back home to Florence, and those ideas and those observations informed his brand, which started with luggage. So I think it was De Sarno's way of paying homage to the history and to the founder, and coming back to the city and finding his own inspiration, observing people today and seeing how they move about and designing from that.
It was De Sarno's first cruise show as well, and he mentioned, as I mentioned at the top of the show, he called it sort of Englishness with an Italian accent. What did that actually look like?
So culture clash was sort of the driving force behind his design inspiration. And there was, like you said, a conversation between the Englishness and the Italianness. So from the moment that he started, he really put Milanese style and the house's Italian history at the heart of what he does. So you saw a lot of that. And in this show in particular, you saw a lot of 1970s Milanese style and suedes and denim. The famous bag called the Blondie from the 1970s. That's also very, very Italian. But you also had tailoring and tartans and plaids all mixed together. And I think London gave him a renewed energy and room to explore new parts of himself, of his aesthetic. So you saw things that were also a little bit more playful, like studs with pearls. There was a little bit more pattern for the first time, like in the form of like this really charming daisy prints. So I think it was a really nice mix and a nice conversation between the two cities and the two aesthetics.
Well, and that is the question going forward kind of for De Sarno as well, isn't it? What did you get, as he's relatively new in this job, do you get the sense that when you talk about that inspiration he's getting from London, is that something that's going to carry forward? Like what's your sense of how he wants to make an imprint on the brand?
I think given Gucci's history here, it is definitely, there's always going to be an impact. And I think that this collection was so successful that maybe that playfulness, those patterns are going to be making their way back. But what was even more interesting was that it's just been over a year since he started with very high expectations about completely turning the brand around. And you could see that his vision and his aesthetic is taking shape, except from these seasonal inspirations that we've spoken about. You could also see that there's signatures that he has kept repeating and he's consistent and it's now becoming a lot more recognizable. So you see the impeccable tailoring, the signature horsebit loafer that everyone knows and loves from Gucci. There's also the Ancora Red, which is his new house color. And you saw it on tailoring, on outerwear, on sunglasses. I mean, our Monocle Gucci pop-up cafe has an Ancora Red awning. So all these different elements are coming together. It's created a recognizable look, and I think it's going to help get the results that Kering is looking for.
And just finally, for those listeners who are in London who couldn't go to the cruise show yesterday, you can, of course, go to the Monocle Cafe. What else can you do that Gucci has taken over in London?
So the cafe is going to be here until the end of the month. So I think that's a great way to get a taste of the cruise show and get the Monocle guide to the city. I think this is the last day that Gucci is here. You can go to the shop and see the collection up close. But also something easy and fun would be to go to the Savoy and go inside the lift that Gucci worked in, and it's interesting because it's the same shade of red as the Ancora red that De Sarno has chosen. So you can go see that and have a drink and maybe go to the Bond Street store. Yeah.
That sounds very nice. Natalie Theodosi, thank you very much for joining us. That is all the time we have for this edition of The Briefing. It was produced by Vincent McAviney. Our researcher was George Ruskin, and our studio manager was Steph Chungu. The Briefing is back tomorrow at the same time. I'm Chris Chermak. Goodbye, and thanks for listening.